Connected by purpose, driven by passion. This is Children's Healthcare Canada's Spark Live webinar series.
Children's Healthcare Canada would like to thank the following Keystone funding partners for their ongoing contributions that support all of our programs and activities: the Stollery Children's Hospital Foundation, BC Children's Hospital Foundation, the Children's Hospital at London Health Sciences Centre, the Alberta Children's Hospital Foundation, the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, and Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital. We would also like to thank the organizations that provide funding for our knowledge translation activities, which includes this Spark Live webinar series, the Spark Conversations blog, and the Knowledge Exchange Network. To learn more about Children's Healthcare Canada, you can go to our website, follow us on Twitter or Facebook, or you can sign up for our weekly Spark newsletter at childrenshealthcarecanada.ca/email, where you will learn about upcoming events, read the latest posts from our blog, and other exciting news and events from across the child and youth healthcare community.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to Children's Healthcare Canada's Spark Live webinar series. I'm Doug Maynard, your host for the next hour. Spark Live is where we gather each Wednesday to curate and convene and showcase excellence and innovation from across the child and youth healthcare community, with our goal, as always, to spark conversation, ideas, and action. And since we are live on these sessions, I want to remind everyone that you do have the opportunity to type in questions into the question box at any time. Don't feel you need to wait until the end. Just go ahead and type those questions in at any time during the presentation, and that way we have them ready for our presenters when they're ready to take them. And always feel free to share your thoughts on Twitter, and be sure to tag us at Child Health Can. And before we get into today's session, I did want to mention that this is the time of year where we start thinking about the Children's Healthcare Canada annual conference. Normally our conference is in October. This year, because of the election that would have been scheduled on the exact same day as our normal conference dates, the federal election, we decided to move it to December. So you can see up on your screen the conference this year, December 8th to 10th. In Ottawa at the Westin, downtown in beautiful Ottawa, our capital city. And hopefully we'll see lots of you there. If you go to conference.childrenshealthcarecanada.ca, you'll be able to see the program, you'll be able to register and do all that sort of fun stuff. So hopefully we'll see lots of our Spark Live audience in person in Ottawa in December. All right, so today's session, which is titled, what is the title of today's session? It is Safer Medications for Children and Youth. Raising the bar, the path to safer medications for Canadian children. Today's session is actually part of our Election 2019 Getting Kids Back on the Radar webinar series. Last week was part one, where we heard from three of our partners, and that was really an opportunity to give our audience a sense of the breadth of child health issues that we at Children's Healthcare Canada and some of our partners are interested in. We had presentations from Children First Canada, from Sarah Austin, from Lisa Wolf at UNICEF, and from the Executive Director of Maria Del Davis of the Canadian Pediatric Society, all sort of sharing what their organizations are interested in with respect to this election season. And it really helps set the context of children and children's health issues as part of an election. It's something that at Children's Healthcare Canada we have not historically done a lot of with respect to that advocacy, and we heard from our members we've started doing a lot more in that area, and this election is a great opportunity for us to really see what we can do to help get children quote unquote back on the radar with respect to our federal government. And our goal with this series, with this four-part series, this today being part two, is to provide you, our members or our audience, with information and resources so that you might be better prepared to have conversations or even to seek out opportunities to influence potential candidates in this election, and to get them to think about and recognize the importance of children and children's health as an important election issue. So for these next three parts of the series, we're going to sort of be drilling down more specifically into the three priority areas that Children's Healthcare Canada is interested in. This week talking about safer medications for children and youth. Next week talking about health services for Indigenous children and youth. And then following that, we'll be talking about mental health services. So hopefully we'll get lots of you registered for those. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today's panel. Joining us today, we have Dr. Robert Connolly, who is a neonatologist, medical educator, and also he is the head of pediatrics at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. And Dr. Connolly is also the president of the Pediatric Chairs of Canada. We also have Dr. Andrea Gilpin, who is the General Manager of the Goodman Pediatric Formulations Center, located at CHU Saint Justine in Montreal, the children's hospital, one of the two children's hospitals in Montreal. And Andrea has had a long career working for a number of companies in the pharmaceutical industry and has changed her focus to be more of an advocate for safer medications and pediatric formulations for children. And third, we also have Dr. Charlotte Moore Hepburn, who is a faculty pediatrician in the division of pediatric medicine at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, and she's also an associate professor of pediatrics in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Toronto School of Medicine. She's also has the honor of serving as the Director of Medical Affairs at the Canadian Pediatric Society, and she's also the Director of Medical Affairs for the Canadian Pediatric Surveillance Program. So it's my pleasure to first off hand the virtual podium over to you, Dr. Andrea Gilpin. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Doug. And thank you to Children's Healthcare Canada for inviting us to participate in your election webinar series. So one of the things that the Goodman Pediatric Formulation Center is focused on is trying to bring improve access to pediatric medicines. And this first slide is really to give you a sense of the landscape. Generally, because of a number of external forces, Canadian children don't have access to pediatric medications in some cases, and the standards are different than what we see in adults. So we don't have many of the medications that exist in many of the other G7 countries. And just recently, a Canadian researcher did a study between 2007 and 2016 and was able to quantify that more than 80% of all new active substances that are submitted to Health Canada for approval only have indications in adults. And so that's a very striking number. And you might ask, well, why is this? Why is this happening for our Canadian children? Well, there are many reasons, and one of them is that there's not enough commercial interest to market these medications in Canada. However, as you can appreciate, there is a tremendous need. So why can't we just take medications that are formulated or approved in adults and just scale them down for children? Some of you may already know this, but it's because children are truly not mini adults. Depending on the developmental stage, they metabolize drugs differently. They may have different variable drug responses depending on their developmental stage as well. Oftentimes, the efficacy and safety may not be known or studied in various age groups. So, for example, if you take an adult tablet and you cut it in two and you crush it and you put it in applesauce, that hasn't really been studied. You know, is the applesauce, the acidity of the applesauce affect the efficacy of the medication? These are questions that we don't have the answers to. And of course, administration is based on age groups. So younger children prefer generally liquids, and older kids can sometimes swallow a tablet, and eventually the later teens can swallow tablets or capsules. So in this case, one size does not fit all. We have a pediatric market that's actually segmented into different subgroups. And the reason adult formulations may not serve children well is that taste for children is really important. If any of you have tried to administer something that's really awful tasting to a child, it's very difficult. And many of the medications that we experience at the Goodman Pediatric Formulation Center are those that are chronic or at least administered over a period of time. And so the taste becomes really important for compliance. As I indicated before, the route of administration is key, and dose flexibility is also important. So a common example is prednisone, which is for if any of you have children or experience with children with asthma. Often prednisone is given, but when the parent is released from the hospital, go home and give prednisone to their kid because it tastes so awful. It's really, really hard to get the dosing and have compliance for the right dosing into the child. So that can result in multiple hospital visits. Drug excipients, this is something that, may not be obvious, but, the amount of sugar or alcohol levels that are in a medication for adults as a percentage might be fine and may not have any impact on us. But if you're dosing a child, the percentage of alcohol then may become very important and very significant for that size of that infant. And also things like sugars. If you're chronically administering medications with high levels of sugars, there's been known that it can cause tooth decay. So the excipients, not just the drugs, but the excipients can also need to be taken in consideration and also can have an impact. And of course, you need to be able to dose it to kids fairly easily. And stability and bioavailability is not always known. Sometimes we know some of the information, but sometimes, as the applesauce example I provided, we do the best we can with the information we have, but no studies have actually been done. So this is an area where we feel that research in pediatric medicines is important. So what happens when we don't have an appropriately formulated child formulation? It results in off-label use. And off-label does not mean off evidence, but it does mean that you have to take the adult form and adapt it to make it suitable for children, like the applesauce example I provided. And often, so this process of adapting a formulation to make it child-friendly is called compounding. And generally, that's done at the hospital pharmacy location. It's generally done case by case, and it's really done at the hospital pharmacy hospital pharmacy counter. So it's not manufactured in a manufacturing plant like a commercialized medication. And pharmacists, I want to highlight that pharmacists do have standards that they have to adhere to do compounding, but it is not the same standards as you see with mass commercialization of pediatric or drugs in general. So as many as 75% of all prescriptions may fall outside of regulatory approval in Canada. And that's where the Goodman Pediatric Formulation Center has said, this is a problem that we absolutely need to find a solution for. So why do these formulations not exist in Canada? As I alluded to before, it's a small market size. We're 7 million kids in Canada, and thankfully most of them are healthy. We do not have specific regulatory or reimbursement pathways that are specific to pediatrics. So that muddies the water to know, how many steps there are to approval. Unlike other jurisdictions like the FDA in the United States or the EMA in Europe, where they do have pediatric-specific pathways. So it's very clear what is required when you do a pediatric submission. Not only is it a regulatory pathway story, but after Health Canada approval, then you need to go through reimbursement. And that is also very complex with no pediatric-specific criteria. From an industry perspective, given the small market size and the complexity of the environment, we also don't provide any incentives for investment as the Canadian government, or, we don't provide that incentive, whereas that incentive is provided in Europe and in the United States. It's also a requirement in those jurisdictions that if you have pediatric data, you must submit it. And if you have a drug that you think will be used in pediatrics, you must submit pediatric data. So that happens in Europe and in the United States. However, in Canada, Health Canada does not have the ability to compel manufacturers to submit for a pediatric indication. And that's true even if it's widely known that that medication will be used in pediatrics. And in the case of in pediatrics, many of the drugs that are commonly compounded have the additional complication that they're off patent. They're drugs we've been using for 35 years or more. And so even if you wanted to bring in the commercial formulation, like a liquid cherry flavored prednisone, for example, there would be no patent protection. So one of the roles of the Goodman Pediatric Formulation Center is really to work with industry, work with Health Canada, work with the reimbursement agencies, and try to facilitate to bring these medications to Canadian children. So one thing the pediatric community has done in recent years is that we're really coming together with the single goal of improving pediatric medicines in Canada. And this has been so far very successful in that we have key message alignment. We support each other in stakeholder interactions. And this coordinated and consolidated effort to make a change, whether it's Health Canada or health technologies or reimbursement associations or other provinces, the fact that we're now unified nationally with the major stakeholders across Canada is really making a difference to get our message being heard and starting to make change. And I'll address that in a few slides. So the Goodman Pediatric Formulation Center, initially we've been in existence since 2016, so we're fairly new organizations. We started writing advocacy letters in response to consultations, generally from Health Canada, because that's the first step in the process. And so you see this on the left. We've written a number of letters in response to those consultations. But then in recent times, in the last probably 18 months, we've really been working with other pediatric bodies like the Pediatrics Chairs of Canada, the Canadian Pediatric Society, and many, many more. KidScan, MyCern, I can't name them all because I'm sure I will forget some. And these two letters on the far right of the slide is really showing how now we're coming together with a unified voice. These two letters, one was on agile regulations, and the second one was on as a huge regulatory modernization effort that's ongoing in Canada. And if I can just pause there for a second, I have to say that the Canadian regulatory system doesn't open up the window often to review the system and changes. And in fact, this has not been done in over 50 years. And so there's a tremendous opportunity here, especially with the election just a few weeks away, to continue to make these advocacy efforts. The window's open. There's something like 13 or 14 work streams to modernize our regulatory environment. And so there is an opportunity to make changes that are favorable for pediatrics. And for that, we're very excited. And this bottom letter on the bottom right of the slide is where we got together with 7 other pediatric organizations across the country. And we're starting to, reiterate our key messages and how we think pediatrics, how things could be changed to really accommodate the pediatric need. Some of the changes we've done, so we've made some small wins together as a pediatric community. One of them is we've been talking about having the process reviewed more quickly, so accelerated reviews at Health Canada. And just in May, a draft guidance was released where it actually specifically mentioned that pediatric, especially formulations, could adhere to this draft guidance of accelerated review. And again, any way that you can reduce the barriers for companies to bring in these formulations into Canada, the better it is, because right now they're just not coming here. So this was a small win. It's still a draft guidance, but the fact that we had pediatrics mentioned in that, it really attests to the unified voice that we're working with across the pediatric community. Another one is trusted foreign reviews. This is a program where Health Canada is thinking about if it's been approved in 2 trusted foreign jurisdictions, and I'm just going to use an example, let's say the United States, and perhaps let's say in the UK, then those medications could be brought commercialized in Canada with a very minimal, what they say, cursory review. And so we think this is one of the policies that can make the most significant change to bring these medications into Canada. And so all of us have been advocating greatly to have this. Now, we don't have a draft guidance, so this is just a slide that was presented to us in May of this year of 2019. And so, but again, you see in the slide, there's a specific call out to pediatric formulations and indications, and that's thanks to all the advocacy we've been doing as a community. One thing about this policy that we do not agree with, is the last bullet on this slide, is that right now, again, they're looking at it with an adult lens where there's a lot more people and a larger population involved, is that Health Canada would have to have that drug mark on the market for 15 years before they would consider using trusted foreign reviews. Now, in pediatrics, we feel that's completely not reasonable or realistic, because we're already using these drugs and they're already being used in a compounded way. So we have experience. So the things that we're advocating for is how can we make this not be 15 years. In fact, if it could be the next day it's approved in another jurisdiction, we'd be very happy because we're already working with these medications. National Pharmacare, and I know Charlotte will talk a little bit more about this in her presentation. That is something that we also met with as a pediatric community, and we were very happy to see that we had a whole page dedicated to pediatric specific standards when we're thinking about the draft National Pharmacare program. So this came out of Dr. Hoskins' recommendation of his report in just June of this year. And we recently, at the end of July, published a position paper with 17 pediatric organizations that endorsed the position paper. This was co-led not only by the Goodman Pediatric Formulation Center, but also with the Canadian Pediatric Society. And it was published, and we are now working on a second policy paper on National Pharmacare that will be published sometime this month. And I think Charlotte will touch on this as well. And the link here will work if you're interested in reading about the policy, more about that policy statement. And again, this is a unified view of how the pediatric community in Canada believes things should change to make a difference for increasing safety of pediatric medicines. So the regulatory policy paper, we had a number of recommendations, and again, this is leading into the federal election. We were trying to, input our thoughts on how pediatric sensitive parameters could be considered. So the first thing that we think needs to be done is establishing a fund and a permanent expert pediatric advisory board. Because our system, our healthcare system is somewhat siloed and fragmented in that Health Canada does the regulatory approval, and then it goes to health technology for assessment on value for cost, and then it goes to the provinces to see if it meets their criteria for public listing. And there's not one body that actually oversees all of that other than the federal government. So if we want to have pediatric specific criteria at all of those major steps of the drug approval and reimbursement process, we absolutely need a pediatric expert board at the highest level, at the federal health ministerial level. And so that was a recommendation we had in our policy paper. We would like Health Canada to be able to proactively solicit and review data when pediatric use is expected. And this is similar to what we see at the FDA and in Europe. So those regulatory agencies can say, like, you've only applied for a adult indication, but we know it's going to be used in pediatrics. Therefore, you must apply for pediatric indication and therefore submit pediatric data. And in fact, it's a default in those jurisdictions. We don't have that. So if we could find a way for Health Canada to do that, that would greatly improve the landscape for us to have access to these medications. We'd like to develop policy pathways to increase submissions for pediatric medications. So this is providing incentives, clarifying, lowering barriers, lowering fees. That would be all part of that second bullet under that section. And working collaboratively with health technology assessment being the reimbursement agencies, because we've had examples where Health Canada will approve a pediatric indication, but then the reimbursement agencies will say, well, we don't feel it meets our criteria. So we need a bit more alignment at every major step of the drug approval and reimbursement process. We'd also like Health Canada to promote the use of trusted foreign reviews and decisions. So I talked about this program a few slides back. It is in a draft process, and we hope that the Treasury Board will have it as a priority early in 2020. And as I said, this is an area where we feel it would make one of the greatest differences to bring some of these medications into Canada, and also to review the special access program. So as part of these recommendations, we need to develop a national, comprehensive, continuously updated online resource to support consistent evidence-informed prescribing. So this would be one hub, not only to help prescribers to understand best practices for dosing and how the evidence would all be brought under one umbrella, so that it would be one-stop shop to get that information, but also we would have let's say compounding, so the compounding recipes would be standardized, and that would be all in one central hub. And I know there's a group that's just starting that early stage work on that. And of course, last but not least, it is we need some funding to fund pediatric research. We have already building with KidScan a clinical and MyCern a clinical trial infrastructure. We have excellent university centers here that with excellent researchers that are world renowned to do the research. We need to find a way to get this alignment between regulatory reimbursement and research activities and find funding. So the key pediatric messages for the federal election is really we need pediatric expertise at every junction of the drug approval and reimbursement process. We need pediatric-specific criteria and alignment in all steps, especially between Health Canada and reimbursement, and also at the provincial listing level. Health Canada must be proactive to request pediatric data, and incentives must be developed. And Canadians should have access to pediatric data that is available elsewhere. And, finding a way to have access to that, because they're already required to be submitted in those two jurisdictions, would be really important. As I just mentioned, we need research funding. And overall, just a transparent, clear processes are needed for every stakeholder that's in this process. And I'd like to finish with saying that we believe strongly that Canadian children deserve the same medication standards as adults. And with that, I'll pass it back over to you, Doug.
All right. All right. Thank you, Andrea. Great presentation. And as always, as we heard this from you before. For those of you in the audience, if you want more detail on this topic, Andrea did a webinar with us back in June. It's on our Knowledge Exchange network at ken.childrenshealthcarecanada.ca. She goes into much more depth on a lot of these issues. She's got a great video that her organization has produced that's part of that. And even more importantly, go to their website at gpfccanada.com for more information and get in touch if you think you're in a position to help move any of these issues that she's spoken on. If you're in a position to help them move those issues forward, I'm sure she would love to hear from you. All right, so now we're going to move on to, we're going to go from Andrea in Montreal down to Dr. Charlotte Moore-Hepburn in Toronto to talk a little bit more about this issue, and again, in the context of an election, talk about some national pharmacare issues and a few other things that the Canadian Pediatric Society is interested in telling us about. So over to you, Charlotte.
Thanks so much, Doug, and thanks, Andrea, for setting the table so beautifully. Oh, goodness me. Oh, there we go. To start by setting the table from the Canadian Pediatric Society, hopefully many of you on the call today will already be familiar with the current strategic priorities of the CPS. But in brief, for those of you who are not aware, 2 years ago, we launched our 5-year strategic framework. And we did this with an aim to engage our members around common goals, to focus our efforts as an organization, and ultimately to optimize our impact by integrating across all of the organizational domains of the Canadian Pediatric Society. So from clinical guidance through professional and public education to public health surveillance to advocacy, we've defined multi-year objectives to see us through this upcoming election, all the way through to the 100th anniversary of our organization. These are the 5: early childhood development, mental health, First Nations, Inuit and Métis health, drugs and therapeutics, and social pediatrics. Obviously, today our focus will be on the work that the Canadian Pediatric Society is doing in concert with other organizations in the area or space of drugs and therapeutics. In parallel to defining our strategic framework, we also built and formalized an advocacy philosophy as an organization. And given the fact that we're speaking about the election and advocacy, I thought it would be important, again, to continue setting the table by sharing with you how it is we defined what our particular advocacy objectives were for this upcoming election. This exercise, similar to our strategic framework exercise, was designed really to focus our efforts and to ensure that when we were investing our advocacy resources, we were doing so as efficiently and effectively as possible to optimize our ultimate impact. And this philosophy operationalizes itself along 2 intersecting axes. One, in terms of us measuring our ability to influence the conversation, and 2, the immediate relevance to our membership, to our broader constituency, and to the population we're intending to serve. So what does that mean? It means when we contemplate the relevance of a particular issue, we think about the extent of impact on the health and well-being of children, the health and well-being of our members, and the immediate relevance to their particular practice, regardless of where they are in the country, academic or community, rural or urban. We want to ensure that we're well aligned with our strategic framework with an eye to that horizontal integration and optimizing impact. And we choose issues to advocate on which we have an established public position. That scope, though, is quite broad. So we intersect that on our ability to influence the conversation. What that means is we think about, where do we as Canadian pediatricians have real knowledge, real experience, and we focus on those areas where we have the most sincere competence, judgment, and skill, which lends itself to where it is we have the greatest credibility. When we speak, we want to be listened to. We have limited bandwidth. We want it to be focused for impact. And we reflect on those areas where we can make a unique contribution. What can we add to the conversation that really no one else can add, or that right now no one else is adding? Certain spaces are very crowded and we're happy to lend our support, but there are other spaces where really our unique opportunity to contribute are calling for our engagement. We similarly look at the level of government where the dialogue is active and reflect on the state of the current debate. And when we reflect on the state of the current debate, we look at the entire national dialogue. So what are the political leaders saying? What are their surrogates saying? What is the broader leadership saying, the media saying, and the social media saying? And having tried triangulated our strategic framework, our advocacy framework, and the current dialogue, we've landed on these two priority issues for election 2019. And today we'll focus on pharmacare for children. And of course, that intersects with our drugs and therapeutics pillar on our strategic framework. To set the table, providing some background information, Canada is currently the only high-income country on the planet with a universal public health insurance system that excludes drug coverage. It's never positive to be an outlier when your outlier means that your citizens are receiving less. So we think that this is a landmark issue that's calling for us to cry out. At the same time, Canada pays the third highest per person cost per prescription drugs in the world. We rank only behind the United States and Switzerland in terms of how much we pay for the same drugs. So that's 60% more than in the United Kingdom and more than twice as much as Denmark, which we believe are two healthcare systems that are reasonably comparable to our own. That affords us a vision of really significant improvement. With those incredibly high costs, we have 1 in 10 Canadians not being able to afford to take their prescription medications. And we know that 1 million Canadians have in the last year reduced food or heat to pay for a medication for themselves or for their children. There are many factors that inform this very complex policy space, from the current patchwork system of coverage to the inefficient national purchasing systems and price setting controls that are in place, to the rapidly increasing number and increasing costs associated with patented medications. And I thought I'd share some of that data with you today to really quantify the impact of all of this. This is data from the PMPRB, the Patented Medicines Prices Review Board, the organization right now in Canada that's charged with setting prices for patented medications. And what's astonishing here is to look over about a 10-year window, and not just the average cost of the drug increasing, but the number of high-cost patented medicines on the market in Canada. So previously, you're talking there's maybe 40 high-cost medications with an average cost of about $15,000. Now there's 140 medications. So the number of medications that are in this high-cost bandwidth is increasing, and their individual prices are increasing as well. Acknowledging those pressures, then this data should come as no surprise to you. This is CIHI data that tracks the per capita prescription drug expenditure over the last 20 plus years, which on brief review is clearly an unsustainable path forward. And this informs this new data, which tracks the proportion of cost-related prescription drug non-adherence by household income band. So again, for those of us in clinical practice or on the front lines, it's no surprise that those who are most vulnerable are left with the least. So how do we take a pediatric-specific lens on this? We've been articulating an argument that children and youth are a vulnerable population that in this pharmacare conversation requires special attention. There are issues in the pharmacare discussion that extend across the lifespan, but children and youth do require special attention if we're going to open up the pharmacare box for national dialogue. Children and youth have unique prescription drug needs that differ from those of adults. We have a very specific epidemiology with a concentration of rare diseases. We have issues related to developmental physiology. Andrea alluded to some of them in terms of the need for pediatric formulations, but there are others. And the availability of clinical data, both in our registered sources, like the Health Canada indications, as well as broader clinical data availability. At the same time, we know that our standard HTA assessment processes, those are the assessments that determine what the individual return on investment is for particular drugs in the system, don't address the pediatric uniqueness or pediatric sensitive pharmacotherapy results. So we have children who have unique drug needs that are different from adults, and we have systems and processes for evaluating the value of those drugs that also need to be considered in a pediatric sensitive way. Now, you dovetail that into the issues of regulatory neglect that Andrea alluded to. Canada lags behind international comparators in public policy, and regulatory standards to support pediatric drug approvals and appropriate pediatric labeling. It really is astonishing when you think how far behind we have fallen our international comparators with respect to regulatory standards for pediatric drugs. We are behind by at least 2 decades now, our counterparts in the US and the EU, as well as some of our South Asian counterparts as well. That's led to off-label prescribing being the new norm in Canada, and the majority of pediatric medications requiring compounding. This would be completely unacceptable in any other subpopulation, and we can no longer accept that this normal in Canadian pediatric prescribing is the way that we should move forward. So at present, the most comprehensive policy work on national pharmacare has been completed by the current Liberal government. This is not meant to be a partisan endorsement in any way. It's simply the most fulsome articulation of what national pharmacare policy could be. And it's outlined in the final report of the Advisory Council on the implementation of national pharmacare. For those that haven't worked through all 200 pages, there's a total of 60 recommendations in the report. And they're centered around this first recommendation that there be a universal single-payer system for drugs. The plan would be for Pharmacare to parallel the Canada Health Act in terms of its principles and in terms of its operationalizing, recognizing that the federal government doesn't control healthcare, so that current Pharmacare policy model requires that provinces and territories electively engage in the federal dialogue, which again totally parallels the Canada Health Act. This would only work if provinces and territories see value in the process. This would naturally lead to some variation across the country, but the plan would be to deliver pharmacare in a manner that either meets or exceeds some agreed upon national standards in order to be eligible for federal funding. Central to this particular policy subscription, following the drafting and passage of new federal legislation and the elective buy-in of the provinces and territories, is the development of an arm's-length Canadian drug agency that would both consolidate existing functions at the federal level, which are now quite dysfunctional, leading to Canada's exorbitant drug prices, and negotiate price and supply arrangements in a more efficient way. This organization would also ultimately be responsible for designing a national public formulary for Canada. And this national public formulary is an area that I think will be articulated across policy platforms for those that come forward with a pharmacare prescription. And it's in this formulary space that the pediatric voice needs to be heard loudly, consistently, and uniformly. You may recognize some of the attractive people in this particular picture. Maria Del Davis is there, the author of our Pharmacare Statement that's coming out later this week. Tom McLaughlin is there. Andrea Gilpin, who you've just heard, is there. And of course, she's standing right next to the chair of the Council of the Implementation of National Pharmacare. I want to emphasize that when that council initially laid out their series of national consultations, there were initially zero dedicated consultations for pediatric health. There was attention paid to regional representation. There were deliberate patient rare disease consultations. There were extensive FPT consultations and multiple meetings with Indigenous leaders from across the country. But the council had failed to see the need to have a specific pediatric focused consultation to detail the pediatric specific needs of a national pharmacare plan. Together, we thought that that was a massive oversight and lobbied hard to correct that. They eventually responded, and the CPS had the pleasure of hosting the only national dedicated conversation on this issue last November. And we're quite proud that what this led to was the very specific language in Recommendation 29. This recommendation is actually lifted directly verbatim out of our written consultation that followed our in-person consultation. And the council recommended to government that the national formulary include prescription drugs that respond to the specific and unique needs of children and youth, and that a strategy be developed to address the availability of approved drugs and formulations for them. That is, of course, a small win, a win nonetheless, but a small one, because the road ahead is long and uncertain. And to that end, recognizing the Liberals may not get elected, they may not get elected with the majority, or they may not get elected with a concept that this is top of mind for their next 4 years. It might be a Conservative or other party government. So we need to increase our advocacy efforts with the development of eSmart objectives crafted for specific legislative advocacy wins. So our eSmart objectives that this Canadian Pediatric Society is behind going into this election are all evidence-based. They are designed to be specific. They are designed to be measurable. They should be achievable, ambitious, but still achievable, relevant to the ongoing dialogue, and specifically time-bound. So with that as a framework for setting some high-impact legislative priorities, I'll share with you what the CPS is actively engaged in advocating on. The first one is to ensure that all children and youth have equitable access to safe, effective, and affordable drugs. We feel, again, that children are a unique and particularly vulnerable population, and in any Pharmacare plan, there must be specific care to attend to their needs. Their coverage must be portable, and it must be comprehensive, and the current postal code lottery of care is unacceptable, especially for this population. We want to call out that all children and youth, regardless of their illness, jurisdiction, or SES status, deserve access to the medications that they need. I've bolded and underlined illness here because most of the policy work to date only comments on the need to develop a rare disease strategy. And the current suggestion around the national formulary centers the discussion around both the WHO Essentials Medicines list or the clean medications list, which is a very abbreviated list of drugs that's part of a research study at St. Michael's Hospital. Those of us in pediatric practice know that uncommon or rare disease is common in pediatrics. And while the universal access to drugs like amoxicillin and fluticasone is certainly laudable, the real clinical consequences of limiting drug access for Canadian children lie outside of a WHO Essentials Medicines list and lies more in the rare disease landscape. So we've bolded and underlined illness because we simply don't feel that there's time to wait to address those individuals with less common conditions. We feel that it's incredibly important for the federal government to show leadership in funding a national evidence-based pediatric sensitive formulary and compounding registry. As Andrea nicely said, children are not little adults, and public funding decisions must be guided by experts. In prior formulary development exercises, the indications on the product monographs have informed formulary development. We said very specifically, given the regulatory neglect that the pediatric population has experienced, the formulary design must be decoupled from the current listed Health Canada indications. And lastly, speaking to that regulatory neglect, we reiterate those regulatory recommendations as part of our Pharmacare policy priorities, stating that we must ensure that our regulatory system proactively requires pediatric-specific data when pediatric use of a drug can be expected or anticipated. The two papers produced jointly by the CPS and the Goodman Center, again endorsed by a number of child health organizations across the world, are meant to dovetail and speak to each other in lockstep. So what would we like everyone on this call to learn, do, and move forward? How can we all effectively advocate together? There's lots of work to go around, and it's best done by many hands. If you currently go to the webpage of the Canadian Pediatric Society, you'll see both a policy and advocacy tab, as well as the election 2019 landing page. Going through either of those portals by clicking on Learn More, you'll see that the CPS for this election has developed an entire tranche of advocacy tools related to both of our particular election 2019 issues. They allow people who visit the site to take direct action, to learn how best to speak out, and to increase their own advocacy skills with the tools that are provided there. On the Pharmacare front, there is a 2-page policy brief that people can print out and disseminate to their colleagues at grand rounds or in journal clubs, share with individual people who come knocking on the door asking for their vote. This summarizes all the key issues related to Pharmacare, touching on the regulatory issues as well, and is easily digestible for people even incredibly new to the Pharmacare policy space. In addition to that 2-page note, which is colorful, again, easy to digest, is a complete advocacy toolkit on Pharmacare for those who are inspired to take action. There's sample questions for candidates, whether you're meeting them at your door or whether they're being met at an all candidates meeting. We encourage pediatricians and those that are passionate about child and youth health to stand up and keep pediatrics front and center in the election dialogue. There's sample tweets and there's sample Facebook posts for those that are engaged in social medias. There's also a list of people to tweet at. I'm not entirely sure what that means, but again, all of the information for those that are more social media savvy than I am is all there. Tap those who you know are tweetiatricians, engage in those organizations that you know have broad social media followings. And if the more we speak with the same voice, the more powerful that voice will be. And lastly, we're quite excited that we have a one-click email function this year. This really takes you less than 15 seconds to send a comprehensive letter calling for pediatric pharmacare as part of the national platform. All you do is follow through the website, put your first and last name in, your email address, and your postal code. This auto-populates based on your postal code, those people who are running in your riding. You're welcome to edit the letter with your own personal stories and priorities, or you can allow it to move forward with the CPS standard language. You press take action, and everyone has received a copy of that letter. We're hoping that this will be a quick and easy way to feel as though you can spread your voice and activate in this really important issue. So with that, I'm going to close. Thank you for being engaged and willing to learn about this important issue. And I think we're all really excited to have some dialogue now and take some questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Charlotte. Great presentation and really, some great suggestions and practical things that people can do. Would it be possible for you to just in the chat box put in the link so that we can send people directly to some of those resources that are on the Canadian Pediatric Society's website? I know that your site is cps.ca, but if we had a direct link to some of those, we could get people there a little more quickly and efficiently. If you just put that in the chat box, we can push it out to the rest of the audience so you have it.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you. And we are going to take some questions. So in just a minute, don't hesitate to type any questions that you have into the question box. But first, we're going to go over to Dr. Bob Connolly, just to sort of give us just a little bit of a wrap up based on these two things and what we might be doing as a child and youth healthcare community. So over to you, Dr. Connolly.
Good morning, everyone. And I want to just give my personal thanks to both Andrea and Charlotte for their presentation. This is my second time hearing them. And I just want to give you a little background that I'm a neonatologist, and I have to confess that I've become, over my career, maybe a little too complacent about the fact that we prescribe medications to children off-label all the time. I look after very tiny babies, less than 2 pounds, and just sort of came to accept that, of course, nobody would study these drugs and that we would need to use them on these kids without the sort of proper regulatory approval. And really, it wasn't until I had the opportunity to listen to both Charlotte and Andrea that really they were able to shake me out of that complacency. And they presented to the pediatric chairs in June, and it has started us on a very serious dialogue about just how common of a problem this presents to all of us every day. The issue about being able to pay for their medications, yep, we see that every day, and we live that problem every day. But the dialogue moved as well to the real problem that compounding occurs. Children being underdosed for very critical medications or receiving toxic doses, all related to this concept of compounding. And similarly, then having your eyes wide open that safer formulations of these medications are available around the world, yet we in Canada are still doing this. So this has really galvanized the pediatric chairs to take this on as an important election issue, and we're very happy to add our voice and support in all the work that these organizations are doing. And so it's our hope that in this webinar that you will take that back and join us in this work. So if I may take this privilege to ask a question, I'll address this initially to Andrea, and I'm happy to have Charlotte's perspective. But, recently in the media, we've seen a case of where compounding was brought to light. It was a child who had a rare disease and was receiving her medications compounded. Yet when a commercial formulation was available, it was incredibly expensive. And so the media picked this up. and actually sort of made it almost negative about or was a case for compounding to say, having these big drug companies come in and now charge excessive amounts of money for what they were getting for much cheaper, was a bad thing. So, Andrea, I just was curious on how do we tackle this message? Because clearly the message we want is compounding's not good, but on the other hand, when it is so expensive, how do we sort of counter that?
Sure, and thanks for the question. So I wouldn't say compounding is not good. I think we do everything we can and we need to do compounding. We cannot eliminate compounding. That's a tool that physicians need. However, let's improve it and let's reduce the amount of compounding. And on the price, it's true that when you are taking a medication and you're compounding it, so you might take a capsule, for example, and you cut it in 4, and that you were able to dose 4 kids with applesauce or maternal milk. Of course, that's pennies to the milligram. You just can't compare that to a commercial GMP manufactured medication. The standards for commercializing in Canada and all jurisdictions actually are quite high. And so there has to be a premium. So you can't, and that's one of the challenges. I mean, Charlotte talked about HTA bodies, or what I call reimbursement bodies, needing pediatric specific standards. That's an example, because you cannot look at the status quo in this case and say a compounded medicine, which is cents to the milligram, and then a new commercialized formulation, which might be, $4 or $5 to the milligram. It can't be just a formula like that. You need to look at what's the therapeutic window. There's many, many variables. So does the child, will they be pulled out of school for months if they relapse? There's the disease state. I guess what I'm saying is that there has to be a premium to make it commercially viable, but of course, from a societal perspective and of course a taxpayer perspective, we have to find ways to make that reasonable. Now, the question is, how do you make that reasonable, and what is that markup that will allow the difference between compounded medication and a commercial formulation? And that is a question we absolutely need to find an answer to, and it's clear it needs research of some sort to find out what that factor or that range of factor would be to allow commercialization to be listed on our public formularies. But we need research, and we need to put smart people around the table and figure out what that could look like, because it's not clear what that answer should be.
Thank you. And my second question really is to Charlotte. Charlotte, I've been now very interested in watching the social media and various other sort of groups that are talking about national pharmacare. They're making a huge argument around, ultimately Pharmacare is going to save us money and not cost us money. And I was just curious if there's any data around specifically the pediatric population, because I think they're talking probably about, drug costs as a whole. And I think that, you made the point about how a lot of pediatrics is around rare diseases. So I'm just wondering if there's data that we can use to empower that that the cost of these expensive medications, ultimately, it's going to, be cost neutral or even cost beneficial for Pharmacare for children.
There isn't any good pediatric specific data. It's interesting, when Andrea and I last met face to face, we were talking about the need for us to compile some of that information so that we can make a pediatric specific compelling argument. But I do think that the question of high cost medications and ultra high cost medications often revolve around how do we pay for it. And I think that we really need to reject the premise of that particular question. With respect to costs and savings, there's lots of ways to spin the data. And of course, it always depends whose cost is it, and who will reap the benefits of the savings. I think the broader, more fundamental policy question is, how do we structure our purchasing and pricing systems so that we optimize value? We currently pay more than twice as much as the UK and Denmark, most of the Scandinavian countries, partner countries in Australia, New Zealand, etc. And the question really shouldn't be, how do we pay for these medications, or how are we possibly going to afford these medications? And I don't even think we're in a place where we should be asking, how much could we possibly save by paying these prices for the medications? I think that the child health community should stand with our adult partners and really advocate for more effective pricing processes and much more effective purchasing systems. because that's where the greatest benefit is going to be felt.
Perfect. Okay.
All right, so we do have a few questions that are lined up from the audience. So again, if there is anyone else in the audience that does have a question, we have only have a couple minutes to take questions. I did want to sort of just review some of the resources that we have available here at Children's Healthcare Canada for you. You can see them up on the screen right now on our website at childrenshealthcarecanada.ca/2019-election is where you can find them. And I'll just do a quick walkthrough just to make sure you're aware of what we've got there. But we did have a question that came in, and I think all three of you might have something to contribute to this. But Charlotte, I think it's more specific to what you were specifically presenting. So we'll start with you. The question is, could you please elaborate on why a national, comprehensive, continuously updated online resource to support consistent, evidence-informed prescribing is necessary? And how would you suggest that we square the argument that off-label isn't off evidence with this call for this evidence repository?
Well, I mean, the fact that we have such a significant proportion of pediatric prescribing being off-label really sits at the foundation of this continuously updated prescribing and dispensing tool. Several other jurisdictions, the Netherlands being one, the UK being another, do have these universal or national prescribing tools to help their pediatric providers navigate this off-label landscape. While our off-label incidence rate is considerably higher than other jurisdictions, we know across pediatrics, for a variety of reasons, there's a lot of off-label prescribing. So this would be a single universal tool for anyone, whether they're in an academic center or a community, whether they're a subspecialized, pediatrician at a quaternary center, or whether they're a nurse practitioner working in a remote setting, have access to the best possible data when it comes to prescribing and dispensing medications. There's considerable availability in terms of access to evidence, and there's concerns about using some of the American resources in the Canadian context because they might not be either the best available information or the most appropriate information for our context. So we thought, as a really foundational piece of work for Canadian providers of child health, both those that prescribe medications and dispense medications, to say, this is what we believe is best evidence, decoupled from indications in terms of prescribing for various age ranges and various unique populations as subpopulations of the pediatric community.
Do you anything from you to add? I mean, you were the one who made that comment about off-label isn't off evidence. So how do we ensure, particularly when it comes to an election setting where we're not talking to clinical experts or healthcare professionals, et cetera, we're talking with people who have varying levels of expertise in this area or may not be as informed of what off-label means or what evidence is, and then we start calling for these evidence-informed prescribing things. Do you have anything to add around that off-label isn't off evidence and a call for an evidence repository? Andrea, are you muted?
It's Andrea here. Yeah, no, I'm here. Well, so what I wanted to add to Charlotte's question is when she said it's best evidence decoupled from indication. The indications come out of a commercial need or a business model. And the importance of this national formulary, the evidence that would be involved would come from the need, the use, the actual use, off-label use. We would have the data for how pediatricians, prescribers, dispensers are actually using the medication. So the source and where the starting point is quite different. There might be an overlap, but the starting point is quite different. And the other thing about this national formulary that is important is that, as I alluded to, but I went over it very quickly, is that the compounding will always exist. So right now, there are no standard recipes across Canada. So, for example, at our hospital, you'll have a certain recipe that a child might take, but if they live far away and they go to their community pharmacy, it may not be easy to get that compounded formulation because it might require specialized hoods or training, and the formulation might be different. It's a different recipe. And so this national formulary will also provide that standardized recipe, concentrations, so it's going to eliminate errors across the country, and everybody will be using the same recipe. And as Charlotte indicated, this is visionary because it requires the whole country to be, singing from the same hymn book. And that's going to take a tremendous amount of effort, but I think at the end it will increase consistency, and drug safety for all the children in Canada.
All right. The next question, we'll just take one last question here, and then we'll go back to each of you, and then I'll sort of just take a quick look at our resources, and we'll go to each of you for just some closing messages or a key message you'd want to leave the audience with. That's how we like to finish. But the last question, Andrea, we'll go to you. The question is, how are pharmacists being engaged in these advocacy efforts? And I know the Goodman Center for Pediatric Formulations is highly engaged engaging with a number of national organizations in the pharmacy world. But can you give us a sense of how pharmacists are being engaged in these efforts?
Sure. So we're working very closely with our hospital pharmacists and getting that information, because the hospital pharmacist environment is a little bit different than a community pharmacist environment. And we've really focused our efforts in the hospital with the hospital pharmacists, just because we're a very small team and we had to start somewhere. We did a pan-Canadian survey with 16 of the 17 or 15 of the 17 centers across Canada, to really survey the pharmacists and see what they were finding as issues, what types of medications they would really like to have commercial forms because of a number of reasons, and when they do compounds, what are the challenges they're experiencing, and how could they be resolved. So we are working with that, and that publication is in the works in terms of a manuscript. And also the policy paper that we did with Charlotte and the Canadian Pediatric Society, the Pharmacy Association, Canadian Hospital Pharmacy Association, was present and contributed to the regulatory policy paper that we came together. So we are engaging pharmacists in this. They have to be part of the conversation. They're a very, very important stakeholder.
All right. And I think with that, I think we don't have time to take any more questions, but I did just want to point to what we've got up on the screen now, our children'shealthcarecanada.ca/2019-election page, and that's where we have our election resources. We've got information and resources section there that just sort of talks about what our role is as Children's Healthcare Canada in helping you as our members. We've got a how to get involved section, which is very much similar to what Charlotte mentioned, where it's an opportunity for you to use that automated system that lets you send something to all of the candidates in your riding. And I think Charlotte mentioned a very important point is there's a template letter there, but for you to add your own stories and your own experiences as healthcare providers or as patients and families, I think that's really critical, especially for candidates. As I mentioned earlier, they're not all healthcare professionals, and patient stories and provider stories that they can relate to really help them understand these issues better. Our social media toolkit, again, very similar to what the Canadian Pediatric Society has up there, with sample tweets and images and lots of things. I think I'm in the same boat as Charlotte when it comes to social media. Lots of people around here do it. I don't do a whole lot of it. So when somebody prepares a tweet for me that I can just cut and paste and use the proper hashtags and everything else, and that's quite handy, and we've got lots of suggestions there as well. And then we have this advocacy webinar series that we're in the midst of right now. So go ahead and check out those resources, as well as check out Andrea's site at the Goodman Center and the Canadian Pediatric Society's site. We put those links in the chat box. So we'll just go around in the same order that we started in. Anything you'd like to close off with, any key message you'd like to leave the audience with before we wrap up? Dr. Charlotte Moore-Hepburn, we'll start with you.
I guess I would just ask those brave souls that are still here at the end of the webinar to please engage. There's a lot of dedicated people who have spent time in investing in the development of these resources. Please use them. The more people that we get speaking on this issue, the louder our voices, the more effective it will be.
Dr. Andrea Gilpin.
Excellent. I can't say it any better. There is a movement. The window is open. We feel the sands are shifting. Get involved. And if you don't know how to get involved, but something in this webinar has gone and what you want to take action, you can reach out to us. We'll help you find a way if you're not sure if the tools are presented isn't the right way for you to get involved. And, as Charlotte said, there's lots of work to do, and we would love to continue to build the voice and make change for Canadian children. And thank you, Doug.
All right. Thank you very much. And Dr. Bob Connolly, will give you the last word before I wrap things up.
Great. Well, my first message is to get Charlotte to join Twitter. That would be my first take-home message. But my second one is I would want to reiterate what Doug says about sharing your stories. yes, we are compiling data, and we as scientists are very moved by data, but everyone is moved by stories. And I have to say the stories that were told amongst the chairs have really what led us to focus on this as a real problem. And so don't think your stories are unique. This is happening, these issues are happening to children every day all across the country. So share your stories with us so we can amplify those messages and share those stories with your candidates.
Very much, and thank you to all three of you. Great presentations, and really, again, I think I mentioned last week this was our first crack at this kind of advocacy sort of work and a webinar series in this area, and I think it's really off to a great start. Last week and today's episode was no different. An excellent opportunity to understand a little bit more about these issues. So thanks again to all of you. And with that, we'll close off. As most of you know, we do our webinars every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and it's great when you can watch live, as your questions and comments really contribute and enrich the discussion. But when you can't watch live, we do record these sessions and make them available after the fact on our Knowledge Exchange Network at ken.childrenshealthcarecanada.ca. Next week, in our webinar series, we'll be continuing this deeper dive into some of these specific areas of interest that Children's Healthcare Canada has identified with respect to this election. So next week on October 2nd, we will welcome our colleagues a number of colleagues to come and speak on Indigenous health in a session we're titling Pursuing Reconciliation Through Jordan's Principle and Data Sovereignty. And those are two specific issues that have come right from the Truth and Reconciliation report that we feel that Children's Healthcare Canada can make a contribution to. And to help our members gain a better understanding of these issues, we're welcoming presenters from the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, as well as the First Nations Information Governance Centre, to talk about Jordan's Principle as it relates to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal's orders and the current state of Canada's implementation of Jordan's Principle. And we'll also be bringing the folks from the First Nations Information Governance Centre to help us understand some of the key issues in relation to First Nations information and data sovereignty. And she's going to explore a number of questions, and in particular around the OCAP principles and how our community of children's hospitals and other organizations that provide healthcare services to children should be aware of those principles and how we can leverage those. So it's going to be a really interesting session next week as well, I have no doubt. So if you do want to make sure you are up to date on what we're doing here at Children's Healthcare Canada, I encourage you to go to our website. Right on the front page, you can sign up for our Spark newsletter, and that's the best way to stay up to date with our activities. Hopefully you'll go to our conference website at conference.childrenshealthcarecanada.ca and register, and we'll see you in Ottawa. But if not, hopefully we'll at least see you back here next week. So thanks again for joining us today. Bye, everyone.